are dodgy. They're not a reliable source in the sense that the Melrose chasters are. David Brown's student, Dr. Smith, established that with his PhD. So treat with caution. We're also dealing, hello,
It's those two. Sorry,
which,
apologies. It's that to go
so I can go forward.
Yeah.
So the other fact is that Kelso is a whopping great big ruin, thank you, love. That's my wife. Without whom I don't address everybody as love, but without whom I would not be here. And you, Derek, of course. So Kelso is also a whopping great big ruin, thanks to Henry VIII and his troops. So I'm not going to concentrate on what is a complicated building and all its detail. As I said, I'm going to concentrate on its horizontality and its work, particularly. This touches upon what you can see at Tiron itself, and I put Bob the Builder up there because I was attracted at the time to the idea of the building monk. It was all too attractive to a medieval architectural historian that here was lay brothers shimmying up and down scaffolds, building abbeys. What's not to like? However, I think that model is difficult to apply in Kelso. I think we're looking at something that's really quite complicated. And if there is such a thing as a 12th century Renaissance, then Kelso is a really good example of sophisticated, complicated thought in practice. Tiron Gardet, as you can see itself, is a great big hall. It's nothing like Kelso at all. Kelso is far more complicated. I'm grateful to the likes of Kathleen Thompson and her work on the Tironensians. I've trawled through the work and found what I could with Wikipedia these days because I didn't have the time and money to go scooting around Normandy anymore. And you do find examples of some of Tironensian churches with complicated doorways like this one at Rouen-Saint-Grove, but just hold it there. There's no direct game of snap. And I'm going to be using this analogy of snap a lot in my talk. I was taken by this idea of interpretations. I quite like this couple of workmen digging away outside the west door of Kelso, because if you look at a literature review, the newspaper, the press reports from the 1820s start with this idea of there's a nice ruin in Kelso, let's try and look after it. Let's get Gillespie Graham to do a survey. And by the time you get into the 1850s and the 1880s, you begin a narrative that there's David I and the border abbeys. Let's look at David I in the context of the other foundations. And there's a wonderful paper yesterday about David's colonization of Murray, and I'm very grateful to you, so it was wonderful. But can we think of the abbeys as his colonization of the borders? It's a damn sight less expensive than a standing army. And you can also economize the whole area because there's other works on the Tironensians about it's almost like a human geographical approach where the monastic economy can be clearly seen at work with terms of trade routes. And for Kelso, it's a link to Berwick, isn't it? And a way to monetarize this area. I'm going to hesitate to use the word Scotland. I'm just going to use the word David. I'm not sure what Scotland is. I really enjoyed the paper about David's linking into the Northwest, but I'm going to touch upon that a little later. The interpretations of Kelso as well, the classic ingredients, if you can see the fruit and veg in the top corner, because there is a kind of classical interpretation that's established in the literature reviews that really associate Kelso through MacGregor Chalmers and his work in the early 1900s. And these are the what you must tells now, because you've got to refer to Bury St. Edmunds, you must refer to Ely, and if you can, look into Germany. And MacGregor Chalmers set that up, and then other people follow that on. So you end up with what they call the puzzle of Kelso Abbey by 1922. And this was in the Sphere magazine. There's images of Kelso, there's Ely, and there's Peterborough, which is another one that comes up. Why? Because they've all established this idea of the double church. That is to say, one with an east end and a west end that mirror each other, with a westwork thrown in for luck. Richard Fawcett, in his wisdom, says we don't know whether David thought of this or his group, his therapeutic community, thought of this in the 1820s when the place was established in 1128, or whether it comes later. And that's a wise thing to say. This is just the kind of thing that Eric Fernie warned against, which is to date further and further back. But because we're celebrating David and the reign of David, I'm going to throw myself into that muddy pool and say, let's pretend that there are some ideas around that establish the horizontality and the westwork within his reign. In other words, the Chris Abraham established in the 1970s that the East End did reflect the West End, that there is a double cross plan. Let's take that for granted. And let's also take for granted that the horizontality that we see in the nave of the Westwork was also established in the East. Now, the waterleaf capitals in the West End and the Clerestory and Triforium area point to work continuing into the 1170s. Leave the 1170s alone. Just think of the concept of the design of that horizontality. What Richard then goes on, Richard Fawcett, sorry, goes on by the 2000s, that is, it adds this smorgasbord of references. So we've got Bury St Edmunds, Peterborough, we've got Ely, then Stuart Cruden in the 1980s, the 1970s, 1980s, adds St Riquier in France, because it's a double cross church. The Carolingian effort continues, but what Richard adds to is St Benoit-sur-Loire, and he also starts to point at Dunfermline Abbey as well, which is great, because when he makes an analogy to Dunfermline, we start thinking in terms of a Scottish architecture, a Scottish accent to our approach. But I use this term Scottish with italics. But we have, well, just after the paper there by Professor Penman, this idea of a dynastic architecture, which I'm quite fond of, because I think there are some terms of reference which do speak to David's women in his life, which we don't offer to. I think there's a Matildan influence here. There was a paper yesterday that said, if in doubt, use the word Matilda. But there's Empress Matilda and there's Queen Matilda that we should think about in terms of his work in Kelso. So the double transit, this is St. Riquier, and you see the plan in red. This is a jolly useful interpretation panel that makes that double cross a little bit more legible. I don't always trust 17th century graphics. I don't always trust the prints. We don't know how accurate they are. They're not archaeology, are they? But nevertheless, they are what they are. So I can understand where Cruden's coming from in this respect with St. Riquier. With Richard Fawcett, we've got Fleury and Chester to look to. Chester's something I'm going to come back to. What you see in the drawing is Fleury Saint Benoit Solar. And what I'm attracted to with this one is something that Richard didn't actually say in his work on Scottish architecture, is this is where the cult of St. Benedict is centered. And the advantage of thinking of this is in terms of Tyrrhensian architecture, because the Tyrrhensians were a reformed Benedictine order trying to get back to the ways of St. Benedict's rule, which, like the other reformed Benedictine orders, the Savignacs and the Cistercians, is an important element. So in the citation of that horizontality, we have possibly saying we know about the cult of St. Benedict and where his bones are buried. This horizontality is actually a reference to being a good Benedictine in that terms of its architecture of the late 11th century and early 12th century. And with the horizontality of St. Werburgh's of Chester, again, in terms of a Marian cult this time, because remember, Kelso is dedicated to Mary and St. John, which is a nice link to Dunfermline as well, and also that idea of a double church of two centers of worship in the East and West, is Anselm of Lyon, who's a Marian scholar, who has his influence through Ivor of Chartres as well. And the importance of Ivor of Chartres is that he's a key patron of Bernard of Tiron. So you have this little thought group, this therapeutic community, as a kind of thinking about the salvations through the Marian cult. And it's possible that there's sight for those in the know that you can reference the horizontality, not only in terms of St. Benedict, but also an architectural language that cites the references to a Marian philosophy, or a Marian theology that was current at the time. On to Durham and Dunfermline and Kelso. Very briefly, this is taking my hats off to Richard Fawcett's thinking on this and how he's established the link between Durham and Kelso and Dunfermline, and he cites about 6 or 7 points of reference between the treatment of mouldings and capitals and spaces and naves and the like. And then, of course, he doubles back on them, the west fronts and the intersecting blind arcading, and on and on. And so he establishes that there are good links between the two. And of course, if you've got that sense of dynasty between Dunfermline, but also the citations, I think, that come with Kelso to Matilda, Empress Matilda and Queen Matilda, which I'll just touch on in a little bit. That I've just talked about in terms of bringing the Tyrrhenensian, when I mean by modern Scotland, I don't know why I said that. I said I wouldn't, but I did, is this idea of bringing a reformed Benedictine order to Scotland, far, far away from Normandy, and is almost maybe a political move, because like the Savignacs, the Tyrrhenensians were not centralized. They're not like established order like the Cluniacs. They were somewhat malleable, but they did represent newness. They did represent a new start, a fresh start, and maybe that was appealing to David. Plus the fact that his family were already patrons of the Augustinians. No one was a patron of the Tyrrhenensians, and it may be something David established his own connection. These guys are my guys. And he could do what he liked with them. So he established a good relationship. Plus Henry I liked them too. So they would follow Henry around and they would be tolerated being in the court. So this all kind of ticked a few boxes for him. So you get a chance of, this is all part of the David's project, if you like, to have his own brand. A bit like his coins, he's got his own monks. Yeah, he's got his own buildings. And I think I'm going to refer to a building that you can't actually see, which is particularly useless. But people often overlook the importance of Selkirk in this process. And Selkirk Abbey was founded in 1113. This is the very year that he got married to Matilda. This is a foundation of a new start for him in his life. But also bearing in mind that as a young son who thought he wouldn't succeed, succession planning is really important. He would have been keenly aware of that. So he's building his own legacy, if you like, through his patronage of an order that's happy to, go and follow him, because Bernard of Tiron liked walking around in the woods of Picardy, whittling away on branches and showing the people the advantages of labor and selling on the goods of crafts. That's all good Benedictine stuff. But if you were to say to him, I'll take 12 monks and I'll send them to the wildernesses of somewhere near Selkirk, you'll go, great, that will do them good. And off he went. And as I said, there's no strong, centralized, established order with the Tyrrhenensians. Dave could pretty much do what he wanted to do. So I'm going to follow Kathleen Thompson's advice and stop referring to the Tyrrhenensians, and please start thinking of them as the monks of Kelso, because that's effectively what they become. They become David's own group, David's own project. And what I find remarkable is that he can do something spectacular at Dunfermline, as he is, at the same time as doing something really sophisticated at Kelso, which I'll try to explain. Yes. When I use the people of medieval Scotland, which I would found a joy, I'm very grateful to that, because I can't read. I don't have the skills to be a medievalist, really. I was trained to, or encouraged to be enthusiastic about medieval masons. But I can't read the handwriting. So when I got it on a web page, I was, oh, thank you so much for putting all that work in. Very, very grateful. But it made me think of the people and places in David's life. And when I pumped in search terms like Ely or Bury St. Edmunds, I got absolutely nothing, zero. But when I looked at the people and places that were in David's life, like Northampton, I find David's group there. So I'm going to refer to you to the building you see in the far left, which is St. Peter's of Northampton. St. Andrew's and St. Andrew, the sepulchral church is still there, but St. Andrew's Priory, which David's wife, Matilda, was a patron of with her first husband, Simon of Senlis, isn't there anymore. But if you look at St. Peter's, it's covered with blind arcading. There's a strong western tower there, and there's a degree of horizontality in the nave and the work within. So we were talking about places that David might have seen, like cathedrals, Canterbury and the like. But who's to say he didn't know Northampton, or his wife didn't know Northampton pretty well? And if you're spending that much money on Kelso Abbey, and I guess Kelso would have cost quite a lot of silver, who's to say the wife didn't say, what are you doing? What's this going to look like? When am I going to come into this in the conversation? And that's something to consider, I think, is the influence of the woman in his life on the man himself. So I'm going to come into the establishment of Kelso and some of its details. 1128 is a key date for Kelso as the move from one place to another. And I suppose usually the traditional answer is that it was just too wild and exposed in Selkirk and the weather was awful. So they went to Kelso, and I can't quite buy that. I'm quite further attracted to the idea of that relationship between church and castle. So Roxburgh works for me. And just in terms of strategy, securing the area around Roxburgh with a big foundation, that makes sense to me because it's an established pattern of behavior. I also think that the 1128 is a good date because he's right in the middle of his fight with York about who becomes the bishop of St. Andrews. And he moves Kelso's affiliation from Glasgow to St. Andrews in this period. So he's doubling up on his right to have patronage on Scotland's church or Scotland's abbeys to have this patronage over who they want to appoint as a bishop, not York. This, and pardon me if I make a mistake, all you good medievalists, seems to be a wider issue of what they call investiture or patronage. And that's why I use the word patronage in my paper, because David is definitely making a stand here in the establishment of Kelso, because what he's more or less saying is that I will choose where I want to put my church and I will appoint the bishops I want to appoint. And there is a pattern of behavior with Kelsian bishops or Selkirk bishops heading up to Glasgow. So in a broader context, I think the relationship between Chester and the Ranulph, the Earl of Chester, and David himself, there's quite an interesting secular link there between the two styles. That's horizontality between the two, because the paper about David's links to Wales and the Irish Sea, well, just getting more and more excited. If you think, oh, geez, I'm going to talk about Chester soon. So this seems to make more and more sense. There's almost a game of snap going on here. The reason why I've got a picture of Mainz up there with its double transepts, its twin axial towers and is Mainz is where Empress Matilda in 1113-14, she was getting married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, at that same period, a kind of gestation period, if you like, for their marriage process as they go from Bologna and then get married themselves. David would have known about that. So the citation of the Western work, the West work of Kelso, when MacGregor Chalmers and then Stuart Cruden and others go, oh, Carolingian architecture. Well, what have we got within that? We've got Mainz as a place where his family knew and went through liturgies and processes with. We've also got the concept of the Carolingian Royal Abbey as the place where patronage of an abbey was established through a royal family and then retained its presence within that abbey, which works for Kelso and its relationship with Roxburgh and David's securing of this entire area with his patronage of other abbeys. That might seems to be a good call for me. The reason why I've got the Holy Sepulchre Church from Jerusalem in the slide as well is thinking of the towers here and here, and here on the transepts of Kelso, is that if scholars are able to cite Mainz as citing similar towers here as being citations of the Holy Sepulchre, who just say that we can't do this with Kelso? Remember Carl's paper on coins and crusades. We've also got the first crusade here, and in the Tyrannensian group, you've got patrons of the Order of Tiron, like Nogent of Rotrou in Normandy, who was part of Henry I's court in Normandy. David might have known him or known of him, but closer to him is his wife's Matilda's first husband, Simon of St. was also a crusader. So although David himself is not a crusader, he's almost citing either through his wife or through his patronage group itself, his wider group, that crusades are important. This is, of course, primarily a monastery. This is a place of worship. This is also a very Christian church. The establishment of a Western work on a Western transept implies a complicated liturgy where services are held The Piscinae, the place where the vessels are washed, are there in the Western transept. It was used for worship. And if you follow the what's been written about Western transept, we're talking about songs, processions, ceremonies, dedications, burials, and the like. This is a working area. So it comes with its own complication. It comes with its own sophistication. So that's why I'd say it's layered. If you start decoding this building in the way I am, it becomes a little bit more, the puzzle becomes more puzzling, but it also indicates a sophistication of thought and building. And coming back lastly to Lanercost, which is a place no one ever talks about, but as you can see, it is severely horizontal. You can't see many verticals going on in there. There is a working relationship between Kelso and Lanercost in the 13th century, in the 1200s, which is outside my sphere of interest. But I just wanted to point to that sometimes Kelso might have had an influence south. Not everything has to come to Kelso. They might have had an influence in the northwest, because Lanercost is not too far away from Chester. Okay. And in conclusions, have I overrun? I'm in good time. I don't want anyone to be too late for coffee. That's a sin. Is to think about the ecclesiastical architecture in terms of Benedict and church politics, with the Tyrannensian and Kelsian bishops of Glasgow, and securing that western phalanx of David's spheres of influence right down to Chester, where almost like establishing an earldom rather than a kingdom, because Ranulph of Chester's earldom was settled. No one really messed with him, and I don't think anyone really wanted to mess with David either. It's secular in that there's processes of war, power, and patronage behind the establishment of the cathedral. If you think in terms of the later Matildan wars with Stephen, it's classical sources and questions that have inspired me. They're kind of to get in front of you and taking my hat off to other scholars. Many of these ideas are not my own. I'm just pushing the envelope a little bit harder, because there's the two plates that seem never to meet, as the architectural historians would go play snap and say, this building looks like this, without referring to the history. And the historians would say, like Barrow says, I'm going to stick to charters, but I'm not going to talk about buildings. And you put the two together, you begin to establish something of a timeline where you just get coincidences. You just get maybe some theory of causation about why abbeys were established and what was going on at the time. I'm going to also encourage people to think about Kelso in terms of other places, the people involved, and also the genders involved. So I've come away from this thinking about the women in David's life and how they might have influenced, thinking of Empress Matilda in reference to the Westwork, and Queen Matilda in terms of establishment of Selkirk, and then those Western towers, those reference to the sepulchral church. And lastly, think of terms of King David I, the Tyrannets, and Kelso as not only something to do with us here in Scotland, as here and today, but the international influences that may speak to Kelso's thinking. So we've got Germany, we've got France, we've got a bit of England, and we've got what's amongst ourselves in Dunfermline. And in that sense, maybe I can think about in terms of a term that I'm nervous about, which is Renaissance. But I am trying to say to that the thinking behind the design is sophisticated, complicated, and well beyond the bare of my capacities thinking. Okay.